the most frequently asked questions I get is what kind of paper should I use for foundation paper piecing? So today I'm going to share the pros and cons of 2 different types of paper and share my personal preference for what I use. So let's get started. So there's a couple questions you should ask yourself when you're deciding what kind of paper you want to use for foundation paper piecing. You need to ask how often are you paper piecing, what size you are paper piecing. Are you doing a big quilt or are you doing small little tiny intricate blocks? How often you will be seam ripping, which is kind of a funny question to ask, but if you are at all thinking that you will be seam ripping, then that does affect what paper you should be using. So there's a couple different options when it comes to different paper, but I'm going to talk to you about 2. So the first one is just good old plain printer paper that you can get from Amazon, Target, Walgreens, just regular printer paper. The second is specific foundation paper piecing paper that you can buy on Amazon or through quilt shops, stuff like that. So let's talk about the pros and cons of both of these. So for this good old printer paper, one of the big bonuses is the cost. I just bought this from Target the other day and I got 500 sheets for $6. So it's definitely cost efficient. The other thing is you most likely will already have it on hand, so you don't have to think ahead and buy before you want to sew. So that's a huge plus. Cons are it is thicker, so that means you'll have some bulkier seams, but I'll tell you what you can do to combat that. And also it's not as easy to tear in the end, which I'll show you a way to deal with that as well. So for the fancy paper, I got this on Amazon and I will link both of these below. But one of the pros or cons, is the cost. So this came with 100 sheets and is $20. So it's definitely much more expensive. The other con is you have to think ahead and buy it beforehand. The pros for this is it's newsprint, so that means it's super thin. It tears away really easily. It also will make your seams less bulky because, like I said, it's really thin. So people often ask, is it okay to go through printers? And yes, it does work with printers. Another con is that sometimes the ink, the colorful ink, doesn't transfer as well, not as bright, so it is harder to kind of differentiate between different colors in the pattern, especially if there's similar hues throughout. Another con is that if you are ironing a lot, which you should be when you're paper piecing, the paper is much more likely to warp and kind of give that ripple effect throughout. So back to the questions that I had you ask yourself in the beginning. So how often do you foundation paper piece? If you are doing it all the time like I am, I want something that I have on hand, I don't have to think ahead. So I usually tend to go for the good old printer copy paper. Since I do have this now, the fancy paper, I do use this, but I rarely, to be honest, think ahead enough to go switch out my paper in the printer. So if you are doing a lot of foundation paper piecing, I would recommend the copy paper just because it's way more affordable, you have it on hand, you don't really have to think about it. The second question is what size of project are you doing? So if you're doing a big quilt, you might want that structure. If you have big blocks, you might want, good structure to keep them together, make sure they're not shifting or stretching or anything, so the printer paper would be good. If you are doing small intricate blocks where you have tiny little pieces you need to rip out, I would go with the fancy paper. The third question you should ask yourself is how often you will be seam ripping, which, like I said earlier, sounds like a funny question, but it's definitely something to think about, because if you are going to be seam ripping a lot, I wish we didn't have to, but it's just part of it, then I would use the stronger paper, because the more and more you seam rip, the more likely that paper is to disintegrate, which would not be good for the fancy thin stuff. But if you are a total pro and never have to seam rip, then I think the fancy paper would be totally fine for you. So my personal preference is the printer paper. Like I said, super cost effective and you always have it. So to combat those bulky seams, what you're gonna do is when you have 2 pieces sewn together, you are gonna remove the paper from the seam only, not all of it, but just from the seam, and that's gonna eliminate some of that bulk. And then another trick you can do is there are these water pens, which are very affordable. You just fill the pen with some water and you can dab on your seam line, on your stitch line, sorry, and it pulls out, tears away really easy. Otherwise, you can also just use a Q-tip and some water just to make that stitch line come away. But be sure to not use too much water to soak through your fabrics or, you know, give it that water stain or anything. I hope you found this video helpful in deciding what paper to use, and if you have any questions, let me know. But I will have both of my papers linked below in the description, as well as some links to my shop and Amazon storefront and stuff. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know.